So welcome, Steve. It's great to see you, Stephen, and thanks for joining us as the U.S. correspondent for GB News.
Thank you, David. Appreciate your time having me.
Well, Stephen, there's been a lot going on in the UK, and that's certainly the understatement of the day. We have quite a story in terms of where we're at today. So I wanted to get your kind help to try to understand the state of the United Kingdom. And I want to go back to a myriad of leaders that we've seen lead the Conservative Party, the ruling party, and then we've got a more recent election. And if you could just help us catch up a little bit, because I think a number of Canadians observed last year with the departure of Prime Minister Liz Truss, and she seemed to bring a lot of potential to moving the UK forward in terms of its governance, its economy. Can you tell us more briefly about what happened to Prime Minister Liz Truss?
So Liz Truss was installed as Prime Minister following the resignation of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was surrounded by crises and sort of scandal during the coronavirus pandemic. He had various sort of lockdown parties where he was shown as a bit of a hypocrite. And he was just seen as a pretty incompetent prime minister, which frankly he was. He couldn't deliver. He was a chaotic leader, and he just wasn't the person who was best suited for that job. So Liz Truss came in. She defeated Rishi Sunak at the time. She was seen as more conservative, more right-wing, particularly on economic issues. So she wanted to cut taxes and to really focus on growth. And she was prime minister for fewer than 50 days, I believe, the shortest serving prime minister in British history. What happened essentially was she introduced a budget to dramatically cut taxes across the board. And at the same time, she promised massive spending. She wanted to subsidize people's energy, and she was refusing to cut back on major spending, on major government spending, at the same time as she was cutting taxes. And this lost the confidence of the markets. The markets sort of collapsed, and she was removed as prime minister. Now, whether she was removed by the deep state as she claims, or whether it was her own incompetence, I think is still up for debate. I think I personally lean on the fact that she didn't cut spending at the same time as she was trying to cut taxes, and she was introducing this new subsidies for energy. So it's quite a nuanced sort of period as to why she was removed. And then she was replaced with a guy called Rishi Sunak, who was a technocratic sort of managerial conservative, not particularly interested in cutting taxes. And what people in Canada have to remember is in the UK, we have the highest tax burden in almost 80 years and incredibly high levels of government spending. So the British economy is increasingly leaning towards a socialistic model and has been for the last 20, 30 years, despite the fact for 14 years we've had so-called conservative governments.
So I think that's the paradox, isn't it, Stephen, that for Canadians, they would assume that it was a set of conservative leaders, leader after leader, but they didn't seem to govern based on conservative values, namely fiscal prudence, trying to enable people's freedom. I mean, there's a whole myriad of regulatory issues that they never seem to really manage or lead on. And so does that explain the UK's challenging economy today?
I think it does. I think it explains partly explains why we're so unproductive. We have, a lot of regulation in the UK economy, particularly around houses and house building. I know that's also an issue in Canada. The economy is overregulated, it's overtaxed, and conservative governments over the last 14 years have been promising to tackle these issues. However, instead, what they've been doing is spending a huge amount of money on the National Health Service. And the reason they do that is because politically, the Conservatives are always accused of wanting to privatize the NHS. And they wanted to kill that political attack on them. It's kind of like neutralizing the weapon the Labour Party play at every single election. Labour will say the NHS will be killed under the Conservatives, and the Conservatives, to counteract that, said, no, we're going to spend tens of billions of pounds more money on the NHS. We are the party of the NHS. And the result of that is that Britain, as the current Labour government, so the left-wing government in the UK, the health minister said, Britain is at risk of becoming an NHS with an economy attached. It represents a huge amount of tax receipts of government spending, and a lot of it is completely wasted, and the model itself doesn't work.
Okay, so that is very helpful as an insight to understand the nature of where the UK has come from and where it is today, is that we've had a whole host of, frankly, conservative leaders that are not conservative. They've really been governing from to put it generously, a very left of center perspective where the state gets bigger and bigger. I thought your phrase earlier, Stephen, was brilliant, that you were quoting, that somehow, can you repeat it again? The NHS, the UK will be the NHS attached to an economy. I mean, that's pretty depressing.
It's almost like a religion to British people, and Canadians need to understand we're a secular country now, pretty secular, and instead of worshipping God, people in the UK genuinely see the NHS as a kind of religion. It's something that we were promoting in the sort of 2012 Olympics in our opening ceremony. It's a bizarre obsession with this health service, and if anyone criticizes it, they're very, they're seen as kind of heretics.
That's fascinating. So in this case, though, it is intriguing how you've got this raft of conservative prime ministers and governments that have not really governed as conservatives. So how have those policies really impacted the daily lives of people living in the UK?
I think the major impact for British people is it's not only economic. So obviously we also experienced massive inflation. We had the lockdowns over the COVID pandemic. Again, Conservatives were not governing as one would hope that they would. That's obviously a huge impact on people's lives. The inflation that resulted from that, the huge government subsidies that the British government decided to invest in during the coronavirus pandemic, we're still paying that off. We spend a huge amount of public money on simply servicing the interest on our public debt. But also, I think another major thing I haven't mentioned is immigration. And not only the economic impact of that, a new government statistics, these are government provided statistics today, shows that for every low-skilled migrant who comes to Britain, they will cost the taxpayer £150,000. I think if they live to the age of 60 or 80, I can't remember. So every single low-skilled person we're bringing in is a huge burden on the economy and on taxpayers from an economic perspective. And we've been, bringing in not just hundreds of thousands of people, but millions of people. The Conservative government increased migration to record levels. And more fundamentally, it has transformed British culture and British society. Britain, if you walk around many cities, in fact, most cities and towns now, you will, struggle to see a homogenous society. So the cultural transformation of Britain is staggering. It is unprecedented. It has happened in an incredibly small and short period of time. And I think that is the one lasting legacy of the Conservative government and of the Blair government. But more, as I said, they increased migration to record numbers. So the Conservative Party's legacy for the last 14 years will be remembered probably for one thing. It's the reason they lost so badly in July. They lost they had the worst result in their party's history, more than 200 years of history, because they allowed record migration numbers, despite saying they would do the exact opposite.
And I think that's illustrated by poll after poll that says that's certainly one of the top issues, is concerns about migration, transforming a country of how many million people again, Stephen?
About 65 million.
65 million. So that scale of migration, that would explain how so many Britons were really quite upset about, combined with issues of affordability, a stagnant economy, and the transformation of your own country. Why would the Conservatives allow that kind of disastrous policies to occur?
This is a very, very good question. It's something I've thought about a lot. The reason I think this happened was partly it was because of their liberal views towards the economy. They believed that importing cheap labor was good for GDP figures, and the overall GDP figure may go up if you increase the population. So from that perspective, it makes sense. But from a GDP per capita perspective, it makes no sense at all, because people on average are getting poorer as you're importing these migrants, which is what we've seen from these latest statistics today. So I think partly it was about sort of free market, that kind of free market globalization perspective, that kind of ideology that's captured the Tory party, that believes in unlimited global mass migration because that must be good for the economy. And I think partly it was because they were captured by various different lobby groups. Each government department said, "Oh, we need more low-skilled migrants in the health service or in, the education, in universities or in schools. We need teachers. We haven't got enough people." And those lobby groups and NGOs simply won the argument. And I think that can explain a lot as to where they're coming at on the migration issue.
So I think we refer to them, and this is actually from a friend of mine, Dr. Eamon Butler at the Adam Smith Institute, who I suspect you know, would refer to as the so-called good and the great, the parties who like to wield power and believe that they are entitled to wield power, and they know what's best for everyone else.
Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.